Did you know that one day in the year 732 could have changed the course of all of Europe? At the time, Christian kingdoms were weak, divided, and still recovering from the fall of Rome. Meanwhile, a powerful army from the rapidly expanding Muslim Empire was moving north, fresh from a string of victories. City after city had fallen, resistance had collapsed, and then on a quiet stretch of land between Tours and Poitiers, everything came to a halt. One side brought speed, power, and the force of an empire. The other brought discipline, determination, and a commander known simply as the Hammer. Most people have never heard of this battle, but without it, the languages we speak, the faiths we follow, and the culture we live in might look completely different today. This is the story of the battle that decided the fate of Europe. In the early 8th century, the world was changing fast. Western Europe was still crawling out of the ruins of the Roman Empire. The mighty empire that had once ruled the Mediterranean world had collapsed almost 3 centuries earlier, and in its place, chaos had settled in. There was no longer one emperor, no single law, no organized army to protect the borders. Instead, there were dozens of small kingdoms, tribal groups, and warlords fighting for scraps of power. These were hard times. Roads were broken. Cities had shrunk or disappeared. Most people lived in rural villages, ruled by local nobles or war chiefs. Education had almost vanished. Books were rare. The only thing that still connected people across the continent was religion, Christianity, and even that was often divided and confused. In this fractured world, no one was truly safe. The strong preyed on the weak. Borders shifted with every new generation, and no single power stood tall above the rest. But while Europe struggled to hold itself together, a new force was rising in the south. In the deserts of Arabia, a new religion had been born: Islam. In the year 610, a man named Muhammad began preaching in the city of Mecca. He called on people to worship one God, Allah, and to live a life of justice, discipline, and compassion. Within years, his message had spread across the Arabian Peninsula, and after his death in 632, it didn't stop. It accelerated. The followers of Islam didn't just preach, they expanded. Within decades, Islamic armies had swept across the Middle East. They defeated the old Persian Empire. They pushed the Byzantines out of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Their conquests weren't just military victories. They were building something bigger, a new civilization powered by faith, law, and purpose. By the early 700s, this growing Muslim empire, ruled by the Umayyad Caliphate, stretched from the borders of India all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It was one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, and it didn't stop there. In 711, Muslim armies crossed the sea from North Africa and landed in Spain. Led by commanders like Tariq ibn Ziyad, they crushed the old Visigoth kingdom and took city after city. Within a few years, almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain and Portugal, was under Muslim control. It was one of the fastest military expansions in history. For many in Christian Europe, it was an unexpected and overwhelming shift in power. The Christian kingdoms in the north were scattered and weak. They had no real unity. No one knew who would defend them if the Muslim armies came further north. Many didn't believe it was possible to stop them. They weren't simple raiders. They were skilled commanders with fast-moving cavalry and organized strategies. They had defeated empires far larger and more powerful than the Franks or the Aquitanes. And then, in the heart of France, the invaders kept moving. They crossed the Pyrenees. They took city after city in southern Gaul. Bordeaux fell. Churches were burned. People fled. Local rulers were powerless to stop the advance. The news spread quickly south to north. A foreign army was deep inside Christian land, and no one had stood in their way. There was a sense of panic, but also disbelief. How could this happen? Who would protect the people? The kings were weak. The nobles were divided. The Pope had no armies of his own. There was no Rome to call for help. And still the Muslim forces kept moving. They brought more than military strength. They carried with them a civilization shaped by Islamic faith, law, and learning. One that didn't just conquer, it transformed the lands it ruled. Arabic became the language of law and learning. Islamic scholars brought advanced knowledge in science, medicine, and astronomy. Their cities flourished while much of Europe still lived in the shadows of fallen ruins. To many, it felt like a new world was rising in the south. sophisticated, organised and ambitious, while the old world in the north struggled to adapt. From the mountain passes of the Pyrenees, the Muslim army now marched northward, deeper into Frankish territory. They were bold, confident and fast. Some say they weren't planning to conquer all of Gaul, only to raid it, to plunder its riches. But no one could be sure, and after the fall of Bordeaux, it seemed they might go even further. One more victory, and there might have been nothing left to stop them. Meanwhile, deep in the heart of Frankish territory, a figure was rising. His name was Charles, a powerful and practical military leader who would soon find himself standing between a collapsing Europe and one of the most experienced fighting forces of the medieval world. Charles did not come from a long, unbroken line of kings. His path to power had been anything but smooth. He was the son of a Frankish noble, but because he was born out of wedlock, his position in society was far from secure. In an age where legitimacy mattered as much as strength, many believed his future would be limited, confined to the background of court politics. But Charles proved early on that he was not interested in ceremony or inheritance. He was interested in control and survival. Through years of struggle, he built a reputation not through royal titles or religious claims, but through victories. He gained influence by proving time and time again that he could command troops and win battles when others failed. While other nobles traded favours or plotted for power, Charles was in the field, fighting, organising and preparing for the next threat. Over time, he earned the trust of his warriors not through lineage, but through loyalty and leadership. They followed him because he knew how to lead them, especially when it mattered most. By the 720s, Charles held the real power in the Frankish world. Though the Moravian kings still sat on the throne, their role had become almost symbolic. The decisions, the armies and the authority were in the hands of Charles, the mayor of the palace. This title, though not royal, gave him command over the kingdom's military and political affairs, and it was from this position that he began to shape the fate of Europe. Among the soldiers who served him, Charles had earned a simple, brutal nickname: Martel the Hammer. It was a name born on the battlefield. It captured the way he fought, with force and purpose, and without hesitation. When Charles struck, he meant to break. Unlike other leaders of his time, Charles did not claim to be divinely inspired or chosen by prophecy. He did not wear purple robes or speak of destiny. He understood the world for what it was: unstable, violent, and ruled by those who could hold it together by strength alone. And in a time when kingdoms were falling and borders were crumbling, strength was the only thing that mattered. As reports arrived of Muslim forces moving north through Gaul, destroying cities and defeating local armies, Charles knew what was coming. The defeat of Duke Odo of Aquitaine had removed one of the last major barriers in their path. The Muslim advance was no longer a distant concern. It was a direct threat to his realm, his people, and the fragile structure of Christian Europe. But unlike many others, Charles did not panic. He began preparing. Quietly and carefully he called up his forces, gathered intelligence, and selected the ground on which he would stand. He understood the importance of terrain, of timing, and of morale. He knew he could not afford to fight on open plains where cavalry dominated. Instead, he needed forests, hills, and defensive formations, conditions that favoured the kind of soldiers he commanded. His army was not made up of showy knights or armoured nobles. It was composed mostly of infantry, tough, experienced men who had trained with Charles for years. They had fought alongside him in countless battles, learning his methods and trusted his leadership. In return, he had forged them into one of the most disciplined fighting forces in Europe. As we already mentioned, at that moment in history there was no united Christian front. The Pope had no army. The kings of Europe were more concerned with their own rivals than with distant invasions. Charles stood almost alone, but he understood that this battle was larger than himself. If he fell, there would be no one else to challenge the continued expansion of the Umayyad forces into Frankish territory. Could this hardened general from the north, without royal blood or divine claims, truly stand against one of the most powerful armies of all time? Could disciplined infantry withstand elite cavalry that had already conquered kingdoms and crushed empires? And if Charles failed, if the line broke, what future would remain for the lands of the Franks, or for Europe as a whole? The answer would soon be written in the clash of steel, the cries of battle, and the determination of one man to hold the line. In the year 732, a large army began moving north through the heart of France. At its head rode Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafi, the Muslim governor of Al-Andalus. He was a seasoned commander, experienced in war, respected by his soldiers, and trusted by the Umayyad Caliphate. His mission was clear: strike deep into Frankish territory, defeat any resistance, and return with riches, prisoners, and glory. Some believe he intended only to raid, others think he hoped to break the Franks completely. Either way, the force he commanded was powerful, and it was moving fast. Abd al-Rahman's army was not a ragtag band of raiders. It was well organized, well equipped, and hardened by years of fighting. Many of his soldiers were cavalrymen, skilled horsemen from North Africa and Iberia, who could strike with speed and disappear just as quickly. They'd fought in deserts, hills, and plains. They'd brought down cities and kingdoms, and now they were crossing rivers and rolling fields, heading deeper into lands that had never seen an enemy like this before. The first real target was Bordeaux. Duke Odo the Great of Aquitaine had resisted them before. Years earlier he had won a surprise victory at Toulouse, turning back an earlier invasion before. But this time was different. The Umayyad army was larger, faster, and better prepared. They crushed Odo's forces near the Garonne River. Odo survived, but barely. His army was in pieces. His lands were burning. He had no other option. He turned north to the one man who might still be able to help him. For years Odo and Charles had been rivals. They ruled different parts of the Frankish world, each suspicious of the other. Odo had even married his daughter off to a Berber ruler to secure an alliance to counter Charles's growing power. But now rivalry took a backseat to survival. A greater threat was rising, and Odo knew that if he didn't submit to Charles, if he didn't beg for help, there would be no Aquitaine left to defend. When Charles received Odo's request, he didn't waste time. He understood the danger. The fall of Bordeaux wasn't just another local defeat. If Abd al-Rahman wasn't stopped, his army could reach the Loire Valley, the city of Tours, and perhaps even push into the heart of Frankish lands. And Charles began to act. He didn't have the luxury of a professional standing army. There was no central military system in the way we think of it today, but he had loyal followers, battle-tested veterans, and the authority to call warriors from across his lands. Messengers rode out, and warriors came from the forests, riversides, and the plains of the Frankish realm, local fighters, militiamen, and landowners who owed Charles service. But gathering men was only the beginning. Charles understood this was not going to be a fast raid or a border skirmish, so he began to train his men for a real, sustained confrontation. He focused on discipline, formation, and patience. Most of his fighters were infantry. They couldn't outrun cavalry. They couldn't afford to panic. They would have to hold the line or die trying. As the Muslim army advanced north, seizing towns and taking supplies, as was common in medieval warfare, Charles made a decision. He would not chase them from behind. He would not wait for another city to fall. Instead, he would meet them head-on ground of his own choosing. The place would be near Tours. Tours held one of the most sacred Christian sites in Western Europe, the Abbey of St. Martin. It was rich, famous, and deeply symbolic. Destroying it would send a message across the continent that not even the holiest places were safe. Abd al-Rahman knew that, and so did Charles. So while the Umayyad forces continued their push, Charles moved into position. He avoided the main Roman roads. He used forests and hills to hide his movements because he wanted surprise. By the time Abd al-Rahman reached the region, Charles was already there, waiting. Two very different armies were now facing one another. On one side, an expanding empire with swift cavalry, bold leadership, and a string of victories behind it. On the other, a rough but determined army of infantry, led by a commander who had spent years turning chaos into order. The stage was set. The lines were forming, and no one could yet know how much depended on what would happen next. By the time the two armies finally met near the city of Tours, both sides understood the weight of what was about to happen. The Umayyad forces had pushed deep into foreign territory. They had burned cities, defeated regional powers, and moved north without serious resistance. But now they faced an army that was not running, not scattering, and not afraid to meet them in the open confrontation. Charles Martel had chosen his position carefully. His men were positioned on higher ground, surrounded by dense woods and rough terrain. This wasn't just a matter of chance, it was a tactical choice. The layout of the land made it harder for cavalry to charge at full speed, and that mattered. The Umayyad army relied heavily on its fast and deadly cavalry units, but now they were forced to fight uphill, through trees against disciplined infantry that had spent years training together under Martel's command. The Frankish soldiers didn't rush to attack. Instead, they formed up tightly, shoulder to shoulder, shields locked and spears ready. Sources describe this formation as a wall, unmoving and solid, holding its ground like a frozen river. It was a defensive position, built not for speed, but for endurance. Martel's plan was simple: force the enemy to come to him. The Umayyads, confident after a long streak of victories, began the battle with a series of attacks. Their cavalry charged again and again. hoping to break the Frankish lines. In many battles this approach had worked. The speed and force of their mounted troops had crushed slower and less organised enemies. But here, things were different. The terrain slowed them down. The Frankish infantry didn't give way. They absorbed the charges, held their positions and pushed back with discipline. The battle dragged on throughout the day with both sides suffering losses. There are accounts suggesting that Umayyad cavalry managed to break into parts of the Frankish formation, but even then the Franks did not collapse. Small groups of infantry managed to regroup quickly and seal the gaps, preventing a full breakthrough. Some sources mention that during the chaos of the main clash, a smaller Frankish force, possibly led by Duke Odo of Aquitaine, attacked the Umayyad camp. Whether this was a planned manoeuvre or an opportunity taken on the spot, it had an immediate effect. The camp was where many of the Muslim soldiers had left their supplies, and in some cases their families. News that the rear of the army was under attack spread quickly. Concern turned into confusion, and confusion into retreat. Soldiers began pulling back to defend what they had left behind. In the midst of this disruption, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafi, the commander of the Umayyad army, was killed. The details of his death are not entirely clear, but his fall marked a turning point in the battle. Without their leader and with their lines beginning to break, the Umayyad forces began to lose coordination. As night fell, the Franks stayed in position. They did not pursue the retreating enemy. Martel was cautious by nature and knew better than to send his men into unknown territory after dark. Instead, he ordered them to hold formation and wait for morning. When the sun rose the next day, the Frankish soldiers looked out across the fields and saw something unexpected. The enemy camp was quiet. Tents stood still, supplies were still scattered about, but the soldiers were gone. The entire Umayyad force had withdrawn during the night. They had not left in panic, but in silence and in order, moving south across the rivers and away from Tours. Charles Martel did not chase them. He knew what this meant. The line had held. The threat had passed. For now the advance into Frankish lands was over. The field where they had stood was covered in the remains of battle, broken weapons, fallen warriors, and the scars of a hard-fought conflict. But for Charles and his army it was not just a field, it was proof that the tide could be turned, that a determined and prepared force could hold its ground against one of the most powerful military forces of the time. The soldiers did not cheer. There was no celebration. But the silence spoke for itself. The invading army had come, fought, and withdrawn, and for now the balance of power in Europe remained unchanged. After the dust of the battle had settled and the Umayyad army disappeared into the distance, something had clearly changed, not just on the battlefield, but across the whole of Europe. The Muslim forces never returned in strength to northern France. Their attention shifted elsewhere. New conflicts, revolts, and political changes in the Islamic world kept their focus away from Frankish lands. In particular, internal unrest in North Africa and the eventual fall of the Umayyad Caliphate would reshape their priorities. But for the Franks, and for much of Christian Europe, the retreat from Tours felt like the end of something, and the beginning of something else. Many historians, both then and now, saw the Battle of Tours as a turning point. Some would go as far as to say that Charles Martel saved Western civilization. Others take a more cautious view, suggesting that while the victory may not have ended the Muslim threat entirely, it certainly bought time, that the Franks would use to grow stronger and more united and more confident. One thing is clear, Charles Martel's victory made him a legend. He had shown that a determined, well-led force could stop even the most dangerous army of the time, and in doing so he paved the way for the rise of something much bigger than himself. The dynasty that followed him, the Carolingians, would go on to shape the future of Europe. His grandson, Charlemagne, would become one of the most powerful rulers of the early medieval period, eventually crowned Emperor of the Romans. And the Carolingian Empire would serve as the foundation for many of the political and cultural structures that would define Western Europe for centuries to come. Had the battle ended differently, the map of Europe might look very different today. The languages spoken, the faith practiced, the very identity of Western Europe could have been shaped by another culture, another religion, and another empire. The Muslim world of the time was advanced, vibrant, and rapidly expanding. A victory at Tours might have opened the door for further conquests in Gaul, possibly even beyond. But that didn't happen. So how should we remember this battle? Was it truly the moment that saved Christian Europe? Or was it simply a small piece of a much larger story, a chapter in the long and complex clash of empires and faiths? Historians still debate that question, but no matter the answer, one thing remains certain. For one day, in one field, history rested on the shoulders of a man called the Hammer, and an army that refused to fall.